The First Crusade, one of the most famous campaigns in all of history. Vast and unprecedented Christian European expedition undertaken by tens of thousands of Christian armies to lay claim to the Holy Land against a Muslim rule. Yet, like all wars, this one didn't happen in a vacuum. Indeed, most Christians at the time, this was far from the beginning of hostilities. In the summer of 960, a vast armada landed on the Arab-held island of Crete. Exact numbers of the expedition remain difficult to establish. The estimates range from 30,000 all the way up of 60,000 soldiers and sailors, during a time when most European armies numbered no more than a few thousand men. This was one of the most colossal invasion forces ever raised during the early Middle Ages. Swords unsheathed, colourful banners from the Balkans to the marches of Asia unfurled, they had come from the Christian Eastern Roman Empire to recapture the island after well over a century of rule by the Muslim Arab elite who'd seized it during the dark days of the 9th century. Up until a few decades before this time, Christian Byzantium had been on a seemingly endless defensive campaign, fought for over 300 years against Islamic caliphates of the Middle East. Faced with insurmountable odds, Byzantine generals had little choice but to avoid open battle at all costs, instead choosing to whittle down the caliphal armies via guerrilla warfare and ambuscades in the harsh mountains of Anatolia. But now, after all that time, in the wake of the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate, coupled with a lasting peace with the Christian Bulgarians in the Balkans, the empire was going on the offensive once again. With a powerful new dynasty at the helm in the form of the Christian Macedonian clan, for the first time since the days of Heraclius, some well over 300 years before, Roman armies would face their Muslim enemies in open battle once more. With the amassing of a fleet of such a size, it just wouldn't be feasible to get the element of surprise. Yet, the Muslim Cretan Arabs, now dangerously overexposed by the loss of their Abbasid patrons, and the destruction of the neighbouring Tarsiot fleet in a conflagration of Greek fire, achieved by the daring general Basil Hexamilites. Perhaps sailing aboard some 400 ships, the Christian Armada successfully made the short crossing from mainland Greece in 960. Troop transports landed first, manned by Varangian Rus mercenaries, adept at amphibious assaults. Planks were dropped directly onto the beaches from the landing craft, so that elite heavy cavalrymen could ride straight off the boats to cause havoc in the defending lines of Muslim Arab soldiers. Within weeks, faced with the crushing numerical superiority of Christian Roman army, the defending forces, many of whom could trace their lineages on the island well over a century back, were reduced to fighting a guerrilla campaign in the mountains, much like the Byzantines had once done against the Abbasids. The capital of Chandax, a magnificent city founded by those Muslim Arab invaders some 140 years before, was surrounded and put to siege. Colossal siege engines dragged to the walls and set on a course of constant barrage. Muslim soldiers, unfortunate enough to still be outside the city, were put to the sword, forcing others to flee into the city, thus overextending its food and water supplies even further. Muslim Arab guerrillas continued to harass the Roman army throughout the siege, launching ultimately fruitless against Christian Romans. Yet, Christians could afford to wait. They'd already waited centuries for this moment, and for their commander, the war was absolutely personal. Before long, the decapitated heads of those outside the walls began to be hurled inside the city, so that those inside might recognize their relatives. This was psychological warfare, 10th century style. They even launched a lame donkey over the walls, with the leader of the Roman army joking to one of his men how it soared like an eagle. Desperately sending for aid, the Emir of Crete beseeched the Fatimids of northern Africa and other powers to answer his call to arms, but to no avail. The winter was harsh, with the Romans too beginning to go hungry, yet supplies arrived in the nick of time from the mainland, and the siege raged on. For this was a meticulously organised campaign with the full support of the imperial capital and its latest Christian Macedonian emperor, Romanos II. By the spring of 961, a new Christian strategy was attempted, with sappers and tunnellers now being drafted in from other areas of the empire. They immediately set to work undermining various parts of the gargantuan city walls, and by the 6th of March, they got in. Within a matter of minutes, brutal slaughter of Muslim population began. Muslims died en masse, and before long, the last shreds of resistance crumbled, returning the island to Christian imperial control. In the very next year, the momentum of the Crete campaign was carried over into further military expeditions to reclaim Christian lands in the east, which had once belonged to the empire. Brilliant and daring strategies were employed to recapture the cities of Cilicia and southeastern Anatolia, front line of Muslim jihad against the empire since the mid-7th century. But who was behind this extraordinary resurgence of Christian Byzantine power? There were many responsible, of course, but one Christian general in particular, the man commanding all of these daring exploits, Nicephoros Phokas, an exceptional general from a distinguished Christian Greek family. The policy of raiding and undermining enemies, rather than simply conquering lands that could not be effectively held and would only be lost again, earned Phokas a unique title during this time. Earned not because of the colour of his skin, but due to the terrified faces of his enemies. Phokas became known as the Pale Death of Muslim Saracens. Not just a battlefield commander, but a strategist too, whose literary works, thought to be battlefield manuals handed out to his men, outlining what to do in any given situation, remarkably survived to the present. His reforms transformed the Christian army from capable to crushing, conquering Muslim land than anyone since the days of Justinian in the 6th century. Christian religious zealot, cold and unbending, undefeated during his entire military career, Phokas soon would be an emperor. In the first decades of the 10th century, the once powerful Muslim Abbasid Caliphate began to finally fall apart, replaced by a multitude of localized Islamic dynasties. As a result, the formerly harassed Christian soldiers of Byzantium, along with their local allies, began to recapture frontier positions and annexed Muslim territories in a gradual, creeping frontier. The border with the fragmenting Muslim Caliphate had changed little in the 2 centuries after the Arab conquests. Border skirmishes, cattle raids, and occasionally uneasy peace. It still ran diagonally across Asia Minor, from the Taurus Mountains to Trebizond on the Black Sea. progress remained incredibly slow, brutal, and dangerous, with entire populations regularly uprooted and replaced. The entire Arabian Banu Habib tribe, for example, losers of a struggle against the Hamdanid emirs of Aleppo, converted to Christianity en masse and settled in the borderlands of the empire. Other areas were repopulated with Christian, Armenian, and Roman Christian colonists, operating as frontier soldiers in return for land. Military manuals of the time talk of the need to drive out farmers, to destroy crops, and blockade towns so that food couldn't get in, thus starving and terrorizing the local Muslim people into submission. Christian-Muslim religious divisions further lent the violence an element of sectarianism. Many were the old scores that needed to be settled. This wasn't pretty, it was systematic violence and terror instilled on Muslim populations of the region in order to force them to submit to imperial rule, rather than their local Muslim emirs. In 934, Christian Byzantine general John Phokas conquered the city of Melitene, thus bringing an important regional strategic position back into the empire, and with it, the local Muslim population were put to the sword. By the 950s, the frontier stretched down to the Euphrates, in striking distance to Syria, almost leaving the Cilician plain surrounded and cut off. This was once a bitter battleground, flooded with Islamic fighters from all over the caliphate, willing to give their lives in the fight against the unbelievers in the so-called House of War. Like the frontier settlers for the Romans, these people had been given land in return for service during the 8th, 9th, and early 10th centuries, and they formed the front line of Muslim jihad. Fleets from Tarsus had regularly fanned out into the Aegean during this time to raid and pillage Christians, mirroring the land armies similarly pushing out through the Cilician gates to lay waste to Christian Anatolia. Now, however, cut off from the rump Abbasid state still clinging on in Baghdad, and increasingly looking to the new rising power of the Hamdanids of Aleppo, Muslim Cilicia and Tarsus was threatened with total isolation. Though Muslims weren't finished yet, not by a long shot. For a military adventurer not unlike Phokas had arisen to prominence in the region from his power base of Aleppo. By 955, the Eastern Roman Empire faced 4 potential front lines, though all weren't active simultaneously. The first was Bulgaria in the north, in centuries past a gargantuan threat, though now mostly pacified by Christian treaty. Second was the Islamic Emirate of Crete in the south. And finally were the Emirates of Tarsus and Hamdanid Syria in the southeast. By far the most dangerous of the bunch was Syria, with its Muslim leader Saif al-Dawla, hailed from Egypt to Khorasan as the Sword of Islam. Saif was a legend in the Islamic world. For them, all they'd known for 25 years was political fragmentation and the news of gradually advancing Christians. Though in reality Saif could do little against the rising Buyids in Mesopotamia, breakaway Turkic generals of the Caliphate, and the Fatimids of northern Africa, who increasingly interfered in Egypt and Syria. The news of his successes against the Byzantine Christians, coupled with his intentional image of holy warrior, skyrocketed his reputation, leading to thousands of warriors from all over the Islamic world rallying together to his cause. In in firm control of Aleppo and Mosul, the two most important cities of Syria. Saif attacked into Christian Roman lands on behalf of the still symbolically powerful Abbasids, repeatedly attempting to regain control of Melitene. This is when Christian Phokas family step into the fray. Nicephoros Phokas had been born in around 912 to a distinguished Cappadocian Christian Greek family which had a reputation for producing effective military commanders. Based in their Anatolian heartlands, his brothers, father, uncles and grandfather had all served as Christian commanders of the Byzantine field army before him, with their origins paralleling the rise of the Macedonian dynasty in the capital during the latter half of the 9th century. Under the firm hands of the Christian Macedonian emperors, beginning with Basil I, said to have been born a commoner, the empire came back from the brink of total collapse to be a world power again. Nicephoros' father, Bardas, fought well against a Rus raid in 940, and by 945, under the Emperor Constantine VII, his son was appointed as the military governor of Central Anatolia, an extremely prestigious command, which he would build upon to launch his astonishing career. The man behind the legend, Phokas had been married as a young man, but lost both wife and infant son to the sword of Islam, and afterwards gave himself up to the Christian ascetic life. Said to have been celibate and vegetarian for most of his adult life, as well as doggedly insisting his cavalrymen pray with him before every battle. It was often said that Phokas himself would have become a Christian hermit had life itself not got in the way. Much like one of his uncles, Christian hermit, and he would visit from time to time. Nevertheless, when the aging Bardas suffered a serious wound in battle in 953, the emperor had seen something in Nicephoros, as he was called upon to be his unofficial replacement, acting as the chief strategist for the Eastern Christian field army. The enemy who had inflicted defeat on Bardas had been Saif al-Dawla. Bardas survived after his household warriors fought a bitter rearguard action to get the distinguished general off the battlefield. The youngest Phokas brother, Constantine, was captured, carried off to languish in an Aleppan prison cell. Constantine soon died in prison, sparking a brutal reprisal campaign along the borderlands and within the empire, as thousands of Muslims were massacred. A couple of years previously, Saif had rallied together a large force from Aleppo, Cilicia, Syria, and various local tribes to attack deep into the interior of Asia Minor. On their return, they were ambushed by Leo Phokas, Nicephoros' brother, who inflicted a textbook defeat upon them. Saif was soon back with more armies, this time apparently set on locating and defeating the Christian Byzantine armies, rather than raiding like before. Bardas suffered significant defeats in both 952 and 953. By this time, Bardas was nearly 80 years old. Remarkably, he'd served the empire for over 60 years. It was now time for him to hand control to the younger generation, one of his brood of general sons. Nicephoros was chosen for the job, though his brother Leo remained an important asset. Nicephoros' command began with a serious defeat in 954. He learned from his mistakes and was able to win a series of significant victories in Syria in the years that followed. simultaneously honing his core of troops into an elite Christian fighting force. The stage was set for one of the greatest comebacks in all of history. The summer of 955 was spent moulding the army into a crack fighting force. Intensive training drills took precedent, and a new corps of super heavy cavalry known as the Klebanophorio was created. Commanded by Phokas himself, this elite corps of professional cataphracts was made up of militarily gifted sons from the upper echelons of society. Heavy cavalry such as these would be the basis for all Christian Byzantine armies for centuries to come. Good discipline, Christian fighting spirit, and battlefield skills were all re-established in spades, moulding the army into the most effective Christian Roman fighting force since the days of Justinian and Belisarius some 400 years earlier. In addition to the native Christian soldiers from the provinces of the empire, the Emperor Constantine released funds to recruit foreign mercenaries en masse on a wider scale than ever seen before. Significant contingents of Turkic light cavalrymen, drawn from the northern shores of the Black Sea, marched side by side with Armenian men-at-arms. The geopolitical atmosphere was finally right for daring Christian generals to launch ambitious attacks directly into Muslim territory. One of this new breed of offensive Christian generals rose to fame in 955 too, when he launched a wildly successful, hard-fought battle into enemy territory. John Zimisces, a dashing Christian soldier who, unlike Phokas, favoured rapid and bold strategies. Like many in the military at the time, Zimisces is thought to have had Christian Armenian ancestry, though he had married into the Phokas family, becoming an asset and Nicephoros' nephew. With 956, a three-pronged assault by the Phokads had led to the capture of Saif's cousin, a victory the emperor publicly paraded around Constantinople, before being carefully placed under the boot of the emperor, a symbolic gesture of victory harking back to the ancient days of Rome. Meanwhile, another daring young commander, this one an admiral of the fleet, Basil Hexamilites, launched a lightning strike on the port city of Tarsus, destroying several suburbs of the city with Greek fire, along with much of the Tarsiad fleet. For the first time since the Muslim Arab conquests 300 years before, the Christian Byzantines regained naval superiority over their waters. In 957, Nicephoros attacked again, this time seizing the city of Hadath. But in the first hints of the future strategy that would make him so successful, he made no attempts to hold the place, merely loading up all of the plunder his men could carry and returning back to Roman territory. In 959, the Emperor Constantine VII died in the capital. He was succeeded by his young Christian son, Romanos II, just 21 years old at the time, but a promising young man, seemingly happy to pursue his father's patronage of the Eastern Christian field army. Nicephoros was named Supreme Commander of the Christian Eastern armies. His brother Leo took command of the Christian army of the West. The Phokads were effectively in control of the entire military of the empire. In early 960, Leo launched an offensive deep into Cilicia, raiding as far south as Tarsus and defeating Saif's forces once again. The new emperor had another target in mind. Masterminded by the court eunuch Joseph Bringas, a full-scale invasion of the island of Crete was on the cards, and Nicephoros was chosen to lead it. Back during the 820s, taking advantage of rampant civil war in the empire, an ambitious fleet of Muslims from Al-Andalus had conquered the province of Crete. From there, they'd raided throughout the Aegean, opening the door for Muslim Arabs from all over northern Africa and the Middle East to launch similar conquests on islands all over the Mediterranean. In 904, a Syrian Muslim Arab fleet managed to take Thessaloniki on the Greek mainland, selling many of its Christian inhabitants into slavery on Crete. Countless attempts were made to reconquer the island, first in the 820s and later in 843, 866, 911 and 949 to no avail. But now, with the defeat of Muslim Arab fleet at Tarsus, the opportunity had to be taken. The Crete offensive was a daring Christian operation, pulling forces from all over the Christian Balkans. If it failed, it could spell utter disaster, leaving the Christian European lands of the empire completely exposed. Preparations began in 959, and by 960 the assembled Christian fleet made the crossing from Ephesus. In the brutal campaign that followed, Nicephoros Phokas distinguished himself as a brilliant commander. A complete success, huge amounts of wealth were carried back to the capital, and the island reincorporated into the empire. The Muslim minority on the island have converted. The son of the emir, Animas, is to not only have converted, but his sons became Christian generals in the next generation. Interestingly, the Phokas did stop excesses of his men. This seems to have been driven by Christian compassion. Upon his return to the capital in 961, the famous Nicephoros granted full honour of a triumph, being granted a standing ovation at the Hippodrome. Nicephoros received imperial triumph in the capital, travelled back east, now with an even larger and better equipped Christian army than ever before. Of course, to the east, Saif had taken advantage of the notable absence of Nicephoros by again to invade Roman lands with a Muslim army, numbering some 30,000 men, the last of Muslim Arab invasions into Anatolia. Leo too had been absent at the time to deal with an incursion of Magyars near the Danube, though soon he raced across the entirety of Anatolia to launch an ambush upon Saif in the Adrasos Pass as he made his way home. Much of Saif's Muslim army was destroyed, and he himself only made it back to Syria by abandoning all of the plunder he and his men had taken. By mid-961, the men from Crete began returning to their posts. Nicephoros marched directly into Cilicia, seizing the city of Anazarbos by February 962, and beginning the encirclement of the city of Tarsus, now in Saif's hands. By December, astonishingly, Nicephoros went even further, joining up with his nephew Tzimiskes to march directly on Saif's capital of Aleppo. Taking the city completely unawares, they ravaged it for a week, inflicting as much damage as possible. All the while, Saif and his Islamic fighters watch from the humiliating safety of the impregnable citadel at the heart of the city. Eventually, the Christian Romans withdrew, taking thousands of Muslim captives with them, content in their total destabilization of Muslim Emirate. Saif was done for, his reputation destroyed. No longer was he the sword of Islam, and almost immediately his subordinates and family members would begin to fight amongst themselves. Though he remained in power, he would face internal rebellions until his death in 967. After a century of preparation, the way was finally open for a full Christian reconquest of the eastern lands of the empire. On his way back to his frontier base at Caesarea, Nicephoros received word from the capital. The emperor was dead. In March 963, at the age of just 26, the Emperor Romanos had passed away. He had already crowned his two young sons, Basil II and Constantine VIII, as his co-emperors, though they were 5 and 3 years old. As a result, their mother Theophano was made regent to rule on their behalf until they came of age. A boy emperor was never good news. Within a matter of weeks, on July 2nd, Nicephoros Phokas was held up by his victorious soldiers and commanders such as John Zimisces, and spontaneously proclaimed the new Roman emperor. Faced with the infants in the imperial palace, there were few who could dispute the decision. Likewise, few relished the confusing and potentially dangerous civil conflict that could easily follow. As Nicephoros and his army approached the capital, they knew the stakes. Thanks to his great popularity, upon arriving in the city, little opposition awaited him. On 16th of August, Nicephoros Phokas, 51 years old at the time, was successfully proclaimed co-emperor alongside the two young sons of Romanos. For he had already made an arrangement with the regent Theophano, marrying her in a symbolic gesture of unity. For more than a year to come, Nicephoros would remain in the capital, appointing John Zimisces to his old position of domestic of the East. Now in full command of the empire, Nicephoros was able to finally realise his plans for the Christian reconquest of the East. Between 964 and 966, softened up by wide-ranging expeditions launched by Zimisces, Nicephoros led a force numbering some 40,000 men into Cilicia, Mesopotamia and Syria, reaching as far south as Tripoli in the Holy Land, raiding and looting most of Muslim Arab fortresses along the way. Along the way, in 965, the final conquest of Cilicia came, with Zimisces, Leo and Nicephoros all leading armies for the final coup de grace. When the governor of Tarsus, loosely aligned to the Hamdanids of Aleppo, swiftly offered his surrender, he was rejected. Nicephoros promised him the Christian sword instead. What followed was an outright Muslim massacre. The Muslim fleet from Egypt arrived just days too late to find Christian imperial navy blockading the port. Just like in Chandax on Crete, those who survived the sack of the city would either convert or die. Lines of Muslim refugees flooded out from the war zone to begin new lives in Syria and Mesopotamia. Whereas Christians, some of them Armenian settlers given land in return for military service, others were Christians formerly living under Muslim rule, rushed into the region to take the place of Muslims. Finally, Christians, the reconquest of coastal Cilicia was complete. Forced to watch events playing out from his new capital of Martyropolis, Saif al-Dawla could do little to halt the Roman war machine. Aleppo, once the spear tip of jihad, was now destroyed, a ghost town. Too few volunteers for holy war to arrive in the region, mostly from Khorasan. They were too late. Some 5,000 of them arrived in 964, quickly disbanded when they realised just how jihad could do little to halt Christians, the reconquest of the East. In a precursor to the Crusades, a far larger Muslim force attempted to get through to the region in 966. As they passed through the windswept Persian plains, they entered into the city of Rey, ending up sacking that city before disbanding. By late 966, it was fairly clear Seyf was on his own. Meanwhile, Nicephoros' subordinate, Nikitas Chalkoutses, retook the island of Cyprus for the empire. First conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate in the 680s, for more than 200 years, the strategically important island had been ruled in a unique situation where taxes were jointly shared between Christians, Romans, and Muslims. Nicephoros brought this agreement to an end, throwing out Muslim rule entirely. For the first time since Muslim Arab conquests of the 7th century, the Romans had regained total mastery over their seas. A similar campaign was also launched into Sicily at this time, as they retook the island for the empire. After a series of Muslim defeats, by 967, peace was finally declared once more. Seyf al-Dawla finally died a broken man in early 967. Aleppo and the once mighty Muslim Hamdanid Emirate became a vassal state to the Christian Byzantines. It is also around this time that the Armenian state of Taron was annexed, the first of many to follow over the century to come. Nevertheless, all of these conquests and unbending Nicephoros pursue austere economic and social policies at home. Phokas strengthened the palace walls in the capital, spending his days isolated. By early 968, his incredible victories in expanding the territories of the empire, undaunted, Nicephoros set out on the last of his great campaigns in the east, taking advantage of Seyf al-Dawla's death to lay waste the borderlands of Aleppo and to set up a siege of the city of Antioch, a huge Christian symbolic prize. Antioch was one of the big 5 cities of Christianity and the big 3 of the Eastern Roman Empire of old, the other being Alexandria in Egypt. In ancient days, the centre of several continent-spanning empires, by the 10th century, Antioch, provincial centre of the Islamic world, still had incredible prestige ascribed to it by the Christian Romans. Phokas wanted the city unharmed, and he could afford to wait and starve out the Islamic defenders, leaving his subordinate Michael Bortzes to watch over it and wait in a newly constructed castle outside the city walls. To the north, the emperor had more pressing concerns. Eastern Europe was in chaos. Svatoslav now ravaged his way across the Balkans, forging an empire to rival Byzantium and coming close to the imperial capital. Bortzes, meanwhile, successfully took Antioch in a surprise attack. Nicephoros Phokas, who reigned as emperor for 6 years, was in charge of the military for 40 years, had been wildly successful in expanding the empire. Many centuries would pass before the long-term benefits of Nicephoros' policies were finally realised. Today, he is generally remembered, the man commanding the Christian Roman Crusades before the Crusades, as one of the greatest of all Christian Byzantine emperors.